Hi, everyone. So we are going to talk about the Boston Tea Party. And this kept coming up throughout the day, and I kept feeling it. And if you've been watching my videos, I like to do tie-ins. So I've done the Salem witch trials on a look-in, on a deep dive, as some people like to say. And then I have also done Paul Revere, and I've also done Betsy Ross, which was kind of odd because one's Civil War and one's Revolutionary War. But we're leading right back up to a lot of things in Massachusetts, which is now the Boston Harbor and the incident with the Tea Party and everything about that. And I feel like everything is highly connected on why we are all, as a collective, talking about the same thing, but it's slightly different on a fray point. So when you do a fray point, when you actually investigate and you look in, and no matter what discipline you work in, you're looking at the cause and the effect of the incident, of the ill, or anything of that on a pinpoint note. So with that said, they're like, should we actually exhume? Should we resume? Should we actually do a lot? And I do see 1789, and it does want to lead me down to Tunn's Tavern with the start of the United States Marine Corps. And there is a lot of remembrance in that, but it really is an LMA. And that is a last name. There's something about light activation, being outside, that people start remembering certain things. And when they do that, it actually has a type of healing of a type of energy that has to do with cardiac. And they end up having a lot more energy and a lot more passion. And this is the Pleiadian Oracle. Now, Ashtar with this, with the two wolves, means there's something of a looking and an adherence and a situational awareness constantly with observancy. And it has to be something that's rooted. And I see them in Boston Harbor before the incidences with the skirmish that had happened, that you couldn't make things up whatsoever. You couldn't make it up. It was very key. It was observancy. They already knew what you were doing upon a look, and it wasn't judgmental at all. But they really were looking at the rides. They were looking at everything on types of transport, because it had happened before in Salem where things were coming in, and it had to do with pertinence. And pertinence is when certain things come out of you, of gifts of the soul after a severe intoxication. Now, the star centers, when they're looking at everything, you can't do a whole lot. You can't do a whole lot. Now, with that, with the star centers, when they were looking at the constellations, especially at the ports, um, I see the fifth dimensional access, and I hear don't really talk about fifth dimensional, but fifth dimensional is really a type of consciousness that you're very well rounded, and you really have to talk about a lot of things uh, when it comes to consciousness. Now, they did believe in the guardians, they did believe in guardian angels, they did believe in a lot of things, even though they didn't show it. The galactic core, they were looking at some sort of like energy, like a core energy at times. Uh, I'm calling upon a mediumship. What were you looking for in the ports in Boston before the Revolutionary War really happened with Paul Revere? He says, I was looking for pertinence, I was looking for a depth reserve, and I was looking for a continuum based pyrum, P-R-I-M. It was a type of pyrite, like a sulfur that we were finding in the muskets. Now, the enlightened God, it was like residual effect, Jennifer. It was a residual effect. It had a sulfur of like a noxious fume after it, and everyone thought it was flatulence, and it really wasn't. It was so bad after gunfire, it would obscure you for years, years. and you couldn't find it. And that timeline, John, it would just jump forward on a pertinence order. And then all of a sudden royalty came through, and then the taxation without representation came through, which was an ill justice. And then when you see what it is today, this is a female speaking through in mediumship, 1717 to 1789, that they would do odd things and solidify paperwork with inheritance and anything of that. And literally, I'll would just pause and say, literally, we couldn't get it out. But with that being said, you have to say you can't do it enough. And that was actually reenactment. That was reenactment, that you can't do it enough, like when things were due. So when you had your paperwork, you would go almost like a Star of David in World War II, and you would show that you were due to show up, to show that you were still intact, mind, body, and soul, because you would get so sick that the change in status was so subtle that you had to have the same people take care of you. So when they did taxation and without representation, it actually meant that someone who didn't even know you could act like you in a type of caricature. It even went to marriages. You all of a sudden they would just show up. The telepathy was so absurd back then. They already knew that the tea had arsenic in it. Arsenic. That's what I'm saying as a psychic. They had arsenic. And it came in like a strike. And it was always the kids that found it. The kids. Like they're saying they leech off energy. The earth, like the natural disasters would actually come through pretty bad when it was an uptick, and then you would have insects come in, and you just couldn't make it up. Like, here we go again, here we go. So you're seeing a pattern of behavior. And what I know from everything, uh growing up from the 90s, was detriment from the affiliates, and identifying it as a nurse in a home is detriment. It's a ritual right curse that these affiliates do, that cause like mysterious illnesses out of nowhere. And then all of a sudden you have infestation, and then you get like a recurrent cough, and then you just can't keep up. So when that happens, if you've ever experienced it, you just got to do the best you can, and you have to stay put where you are. Don't give up on it. But service was really nothing. Like, people could still work really well during that time period, even if they had a loss. There was a type of knowledge, a type of education that came from word of mouth. I do see at home, but in the schools, on how to deal with it. The dolphin play in this card has to do with the pertinence. They would make it into a game. Portals for this, it was rare. Like, I definitely don't see the portals. I see the universal portals, but I don't see the port of starboard. And that's how they would just deter it. It's just a play of words and a play of game. Transmission, how they actually like transferred other things, like how we know today, like if you got sick, like COVID or anything of that, to a radio signal or a communication, it really had to do with intuitive body talk. But there was something else called sound transference, and they're showing me their rifles, and that you could hear almost a silent on the home front. And when you actually hear it, it's so silent because the gunpowder makes it so still in the air that you can hear for miles. Not only it changes the crystalli in your ears, like almost like a type of vestibular damage, to where you can hear fine-tuned frequencies that they could actually hear down to the soul at times, depending on where they were. There was a lot of accusatory of imagination that this was all made up. And then they would have to say, I'm so sorry. I'm just so sorry. And it would just like, it just came to me. And that's when it really started. And it was so different from any other lifetime that when they looked at the rope at the ports for the ship and it frayed, if it frayed a certain way, they knew that the salt content in the sea was different and that it was creative. And that's where it leads me back down to Florida, where they had the issues with the hammerheads all of a sudden. And then up here in the north, we have our issue more with the great whites. So when they do the expansion compassion, you can't do it enough. And that's when the repetitive came through. And that's when they said, you gotta be intoxicated. You gotta be intoxicated. And it says, nope, nope, I got everything I need. I've got the golden egg. I've got everything I need, everything I need. And then you would hear it through them. They were so loose from having so many ins. It was a form of prostitution that was rare, that you could actually feel their vibration coming through. The universal heart literally meant like there were some people who actually just, there's I see LUV with that. The dreams started being absurd. Absurd. They started having visions. Some of them were like odd visions, and they were clear sunlight, not intoxicated. And then they started speaking like tongues. And then that's when people started getting together and saying there was something not right. And there were some people who were just considered family. They were just considered family. Now, when they looked at like how the picture is, like the crystalline grids and the stars, they would actually start noticing patterns of the days, of the week, of the month, of the year, of the season, of the calling upons. Their light technology literally was not just a sundial, it was something else. And they're like, we're just not going to tell you where we got that information. They were point blank. Their heritage, the mother and father healing, it would just be, no, mom and dad move in with me because, it's just time. It's just time, to where they were the shining star at that moment. And it really was taking chances when they had a lot of people come through. Now let's look at the Light Seers Tarot, and then we will go to another Oracle deck. Need to know. So I do see the explosion. I do see the cobblestone streets. I do see the horse's hoof, and I do see abscesses. And it's very similar to how it is today, where there's just certain terrain that some of these animals cannot be on. And there's still some issues where it would cause that disruptance. And then you had to remember that everything was okay. Good night, sweetie. That you couldn't just do it. You just have to excuse my daughter. The Nine of Wands when it was a lookout, because they were their working animals, and they were usually very tied to their animals in a good way. In a good way. It was very hard, but then on the flip, it was they were content. I have my animal and I speak with them. Now, with the Three of Pentacles, they did have teamwork with it. I don't see a whole lot of celebrations in that era. I do see um, bad justice that was not spoken of to the courthouse. There was a degree of imbalance of all values, but they were still rich. Not like how it was in Salem. When I get a lead over, led over, and I do that, they do a stick, and I see it was quite a struggle for Plymouth. Now, the Knight of Pentacles literally shows of a prudency of a path unknown. And there was an odd spelling to it. They weren't really good at hiding something up there. I'm seeing more past the Harvard, Cambridge area where they would find this. When they go back down the crossroads, when they lead through the path, they went, why did it go to Bunker Hill? The Knight of Swords in reverse showed like road closures. I saw halt stops to separations, absolute separations. Like you cannot be with them at all because you're not getting the message. You're not getting the message. That's what I'm seeing. That was started happening. And then it went to isolation, like the lockdowns and COVID, where you had to be isolated. And it's something that they remembered coming over from England, where it was more, they want to put like on the Belfast side, on the Isle of Wight. It was just kind of odd. It was just kind of odd. But I'm seeing like a type of flu. There was a type of flu that went through. It wasn't a lot of magic. I'm do seeing the pyrite. I do see the the women, and I do see I see dry muskets. I see dry muskets, and you had to prime it to a degree where it would go down easy. So exactly when they had their muskets and they would prime the down and then pull it out, it would go in a smooth array, you would say, but actually you would know your musket and the remnants of it, of how much you've gone through it. And when it was odd, just like how you know anything else, you know your pistols, you know your rifles, you know anything else that you work with your tools, they knew that it was some sort of inhibition. And it's very similar. They're showing me like something that happened uh like in the 70s. Another person touched on what was happening with witchcraft in the 70s, and then with the 80s, where they kept doing this a lot. And there was a type of stick that they would do, because I also see like gunpowder up the nose in a stick. Now, the Four of Cups showed like a stone face, when this happened. And that is when it would really like stop. Now, the Six of Wands was the victory. The Three of Cups, they would stop everything, everything. The Eight of Cups, literally, you couldn't do it enough. It was so deceitful. So they would just come in and they would be already ready and primed. And then they would go, and then you would go have a drink with a few people, uh, because their alcohol content was way different and it was meant for something else. Also, at times that they would go, they would be done for years if it ever would come back. And that's something that they had never encountered before. Never. I'm trying to lead back to the pyrite. So I see a young gentleman. He says the pyrite, the gunpowder, was a yellow sulfur like that we couldn't contain. And we couldn't contain, or it was related to pertinence. It was related to pertinence. Yeah, I see it, it rears an ugly head. He's showing me like a lion, like a warmonger, a trolling. They made a lot of money off it. They made a lot of money off it. So when Paul Revere actually rode at night, he's showing me in a glimpse, they had nothing left. And that's why he had his lantern. He goes, I literally didn't even have a lantern. Our resources were so skull and bone dry from casting out everything with whatever we had. You couldn't ride at night. And that is when that Page of Pentacles comes in and says, you go forth and north and be a bay. And it happened all over again, like Salem. That darkness lasted a 3 to a 4. And he's showing me a political mask that they do, like the caricatures, as a type. And it's such a type of emotion that came through that you can't do it. The lack of clarity that these individuals had that played around with this type of criminal activity was so sound that you could actually hear their thoughts at times. And it was quite disturbing. The Ten of Swords states that you can't do it enough. The Ace of Cups says some actually had to be quiet and be psychic. That's when they started seeing a lot of that type of criminal activity that's quite unhonorable. And they couldn't figure out. It was such a tizzy in the head, like a warp. I see them, I get that feeling they're showing me, and that feeling like all of a sudden something so simple, and they would just like do something like that, like they were drunk, that they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. And I'm like, I'm so tired of saying they can't do it and they can't do it. This is so relevant per se. Now the Ten of Wands, literally in reverse, showing me like you'll see it walking and hiking. It's so natural and common that they used that. It's planted almost. That is where you literally would just rise up. And we'll talk about that in part 2. That's how they secured a lot of their inheritance, with the taxation without representation and with Bunker Hill and all those big things. So I have a couple of people who are just like leading me into talking about the Dragoons and the movie The Patriot and how relevant it was. So let's actually go to the Literary Witches Oracle. All right. So there was huge mysteries there, and it wasn't a mystery for them because they were leading. And so when they had to use their lanterns, they literally lit the soul. It was like fluorescent. Fluorescent. They were glowing, lit. It's so bizarre, but they were so highly devoted on keeping it that way. And they're showing me liver cirrhosis. They were fluorescent yellow with cirrhosis of the liver, but they were so brave that they were willing to take on with those things that you couldn't understand, that they were just tragic warriors. They put the words about tragic warriors. They were smart though. They were still intact. In my experience with those who worked with liver cirrhosis, with like whatever it was, hepatitis, they are still like full forward on, even when they're on their deathbed, unable to walk, they're going to do it. That is the strength of the body, but also the soul connected correctly to everything. It was a beautiful demure, one had said, to where it caused quite the outlook of the tree. The urine, when they did go outside to do elimination, as they call it in healthcare, it changed like the grass, like what you see with the urine stains, but it was odd. They had vivid visions. They were usually loners, but they were well in a community. Were they in fantasy? Were they in reality? Were together? Where were they getting that power? Gunpowder, a type of gunpowder that's so natural that you can't reserve it. They picked up on it though. It was literally right in it. And when I'm seeing like the mineral deposits, if I was a doctor, I would literally just look at it to a point where it was so simple to look at the color and the smell and the content and how everyone reacted, that you could boil it out and it would be sterile still. That is the oddest story. And that's where they threw me right back to the Tea Party and I said, arsenic. It's like arsenic. It's highly grotesque how they thought how to do these crimes. And the only way was a type of noose to get it done, a DUN. Now, with this card with the noose, it do see the literal sense of a type of hanging. but it was a type of hanging that you had to be Venus, where the wildlife was the hunter. It really was. You had to use the petunias, which was odd. It would slink in pretty quick to where it was untamed value. They healed quickly. They healed quickly. A type of nostalgia that you didn't want. They remembered you from another. And that's when the losses started happening. That's when it started turning into a game of fun of trying to remember who people were from another lifetime to another day of a life, anything of that, and just go have fun with you. Now, there are some people who do remember past lives, who do recognize almost like a type of deja vu, but it's really rare for someone to sit and say, I remember you, I remember this era, I remember this day, and we did this and to the exact date and time. It's very creepy. Rider White Tarot. All right. So I see their crops, but I also see that it wasn't well. They had a hard time with how things ended at the end of their seasons. It wasn't to the best of the May. They were secure as far as what they needed, but it was still beknownst that you had to stock up because the upheaval would come at some point. Now, with that, the type of separations that they were looking for was so great that they said, I just couldn't crack you, stone. And the stone comes to the life of such a teamwork that it shouldn't even be done on a walk to have it all. And that was the ending of a completed cycle. It was meant to literally have a false start, even all the way down to the ant of the earth. Now, the deceit and the turning away of the delusion to have the victory was so skilled, even up to agriculture, that they remembered how to do everything down to the tea, how to make tea, to do something so heinous for fun and for a gain. And it went to remind me like as gain pods, the Tide Pods, eating it. That's how stupid it got. And that's where people started uprising. Now, with that being said, you can't struggle enough to where you have all of it come through. And I see it right in your face. The poverty level comes through where you can't stun it to the ill justice. The Page of Cups has such a beknownst ill way of life that it's all forms of a spelling. Like they would make curds and whey and have such a delusion of eating porridge. That's when everyone say, just snap out of it. And when they would snap out of it, you couldn't do it. And they're like, you took away my pertinence. And that is how they all started getting cocky. And when they started getting cocky, you can use your imagination. And that is where the Revolutionary War started. But how did it migrate all the way down to almost an all war? But it wasn't an all war. But that's all you need to know. It really is all you need to know. The Page of Wands comes forth to something of a hidden motive that was so stupid, because I'm seeing the spine and I'm seeing the core strength and I see the urine and I see the ant, but it was the bite of the apple all the way down to the toast of a toaster on the fire. You couldn't say it enough. That is where you knew that Lucifer was back, complete to the whole propel forward. And that is all they want me to know on this one individual. This one woman, they said, in history would just show up out of nowhere where you couldn't move your bowels, you couldn't do anything, you couldn't say anything. And it was just like the Sanderson sisters, just like say like she was a Pete and repeat. So when you look through the glass again, it comes forth and north and be a bay and can't be a say. Those were the signs they were looking for in documented history to have it done. You can't be alone. And then the spellings of the words would drop off. And that's when you knew you couldn't say anything, even up to trashy, back to home, to be it known. And that's all you need to know. Part 2 is coming